The UAP Harold, Case File 016. The flying saucers were ours. It is a little after sunset, somewhere over the American Midwest, in the late 1950s. An airline pilot is at 20,000 feet, the cabin behind him going dark. And then he sees it, high above him, higher than anything has any right to be, a silver object, burning like it has caught fire, hanging dead still against the last light in the sky. No wings he can make out, no sound, it just sits there. So he does what any good pilot does. He reports it, he radios it in, he lands, he writes it up, a fiery, unidentified object over the United States. And he is not the only one. All across the country that same year, thousands of people are looking up and reaching for the same word, flying saucers. And here is the part that should stop you cold. Somewhere in Washington, at that very moment, there is a man who can tell you exactly what that pilot saw. He can pull a logbook, match a time and a heading, and name the object. He knows, and he has been ordered never to say it. Not to the pilot, not to the public, not to anyone, because the thing in the sky was not from another world. It was from Nevada. Tonight, a real declassified CIA file, 406 pages on the most secret aircraft the United States ever built, and the one sentence buried inside it that quietly rewrote the history of the American UFO. In its own words, the agency's history states that its spy planes, the U-2 and later a plane called OXCART, accounted for more than one-half of all UFO reports during the late 1950s and most of the 1960s. More than half of the flying saucers that frightened Cold War America were us. But stay with me, because this is a Harold file, and Harold files have a second flaw. The cover-up was real. The sky really was managed on purpose by our own government. But what it hid was not what you think. And the very number that makes this story famous is one that serious people, skeptics and believers alike, say cannot possibly be true. So let us open the file and find out which. Start, as we always do, with the object in your hand. Except in this case, the object is not a saucer, and it is not a scrap of metal. It is a book, a 406-page book, bound and typed and stamped, titled, and read this slowly, The Central Intelligence Agency and Overhead Reconnaissance, the U-2 and OXCART Programs, 1954 to 1974. It was written inside the CIA for the CIA by two of the agency's own staff historians, Gregory Pedlow and Donald Welzenbach, and it was finished in 1992. And on the day it was finished, almost no one on Earth was allowed to read a word of it.
The cover is marked secret, no foreign, meaning it may not be shown even to Allied governments. Every page carries that same header, later struck through in the declassified release. The foreword is signed by J. Kenneth MacDonald, Chief of the CIA History Staff, April 1992. And the release block on the cover reads, Approved for Release, 2026.
So let us be precise about how this document came into the daylight, because provenance is the whole game, and the honest version is more interesting than the myth. This file was not leaked. It did not just surface. It came out in stages, and you can check every one of them. In 2013, after years of Freedom of Information Act pressure, led by a researcher at the National Security Archive, the CIA released this history publicly for the first time. And it made worldwide headlines because it was the first official CIA document ever to use the name Area 51 and to put a map in print showing exactly where it is, out on the dry lake bed at Groom Lake, Nevada. Then, the following year, reporters reading deeper into that same history found the UFO passage, and the story went around the planet a second time. The CIA says the flying saucers were spy planes, and then, in the 2026 war.gov disclosure, the government released its UFO holdings again, this batch stamped for release in 2026, which is the copy sitting in our case file tonight. Written in '92, named Area 51 in 2013, re-released in 2026. That long, public, checkable history is not a weakness, it is the strength. You do not have to trust us. You can pull the same 406 pages we did, and they are worth pulling because this is not a cartoon. It is the real institutional memory of the men who ran the program, the engineers, the pilots, the directors, told in dry, careful, footnoted prose, which is exactly what makes the UFO sentence in the middle of it so extraordinary. It is not a confession, it is an aside, a housekeeping detail dropped into a chapter about test flights as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world.
And note what is still missing. The released history is heavily redacted in places. Whole passages remain blacked out, densest around the infrared sensors built to sniff out Soviet nuclear tests and around the locations of forward bases. A 16-volume internal history of the program's operations office is cited again and again in the footnotes and remains classified in full to this day.
Hold on to that. Even the document that explains the sources is not the whole story. But what it does say, it says on the record. So let us go back to the beginning, not of the sightings, but of the machine that the CIA says made most of them. To understand why America's skies filled with silver objects in the late 1950s, you have to understand the problem that obsessed Washington at the start of that decade. And it had nothing to do with outer space. It was this: nobody knew what was inside the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain had slammed down. Spies could not get in. Radio intercepts had gone quiet, and America was terrified that Stalin's successors were building bombers and missiles by the hundreds while the United States sat blind. The generals wanted to know, and the only way to know was to fly over Soviet territory and take pictures, which, in an era of jet fighters and anti-aircraft guns, was very close to suicide. The solution came from a Lockheed engineer named Clarence Johnson, everyone called him Kelly, who ran a secret design shop in Burbank, California, nicknamed the Skunk Works. His idea was radical. Do not build a faster plane or a tougher one. Build one that simply flies higher than anything on Earth can reach. Bolt a jet engine to what is essentially a glider. Give it enormous wings, strip out everything heavy, and let it float at over 70,000 feet, 13 miles up, where no Soviet fighter and no missile of the day could touch it. He called it, with some affection, the Angel.
I was impressed with the secrecy aspect of it. I was essentially being drafted.
That is Kelly Johnson, remembering the day the CIA took over his airplane, because President Eisenhower made a fateful decision. He would not give this to the Air Force. He wanted deniability, a program he could disown if it ever went wrong. So he handed the whole thing to the CIA, and he was blunt about why.
I want this whole thing to be a civilian operation.
A civilian agency, civilian pilots, or men made to look civilian. A cover story about weather research. The program was codenamed Aquatone, and the man put in charge of it was a brilliant, driven CIA officer named Richard Bissell, who ran it out of a few plain office buildings in Washington and funded it, at first, with a personal check he mailed to Lockheed for more than $1 million. But a secret plane needs a secret place to fly. And in April of 1955, Bissell, a test pilot named Tony Livier, and Kelly Johnson went hunting for one, flying low over the Nevada desert until they spotted a flat, dry lake bed beside an old airstrip. It was empty, it was nowhere, and it was perfect. To lure workers out to the middle of that wasteland, Johnson gave it a hopeful, sarcastic name.
Paradise Ranch.
Paradise Ranch, soon shortened by the men stuck living there to just the ranch. On the government's own maps, the parcel of desert had a duller designation, a number, Area 51. By late July of 1955, the first Angel had been trucked out to that lakebed in pieces and reassembled in a hangar. Within weeks, it was climbing past 50,000 feet, then 65,000 into an emptiness no aircraft had ever routinely occupied. It flew so high and so quietly, and it looked so utterly unlike a normal airplane that from the ground, if you could see it at all, it did not read as a plane. And that, the CIA would later admit, is where the flying saucers came from. Here is the mechanism exactly as the document lays it out, and it is so simple that once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. In the mid-1950s, commercial airliners cruised low, between 10 and 20,000 feet. Military jets rarely went above 40. The public and the pilots had a mental ceiling for how high a man-made object could be. And then the U-2 shattered that ceiling, flying at more than 60,000 feet, 3 times higher than the airliners beneath it. Now add the one detail that turns a spy plane into a saucer. The early U-2s were not painted. They were bare, polished silver metal. And picture the moment at the end of the day. Down at 20,000 feet, an airline pilot has already watched the sun set. His world has gone into shadow. But 13 miles above him, the U-2 is still in blazing sunlight because from that altitude, the horizon is far away and the sun has not yet dropped below it. So its silver wings catch the light and throw it back down. A brilliant, fiery, self-luminous object, hanging motionless in a darkening sky, with no visible wings and no engine noise. Listen to how the agency's own history describes it.
The early U-2s were silver, and they reflected the rays from the sun, especially at sunrise and sunset. They often appeared as fiery objects to observers below.
Fiery objects. To thousands of observers below, who did exactly what you would do, they reported them. And those reports flowed into Operation Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation, filed away at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Blue Book's job was to explain sightings. But the men at Blue Book did not know about a secret CIA spy plane flying over their own country. So how did so many cases get quietly closed? Because, the history says, the Air Force investigators had a phone number.
By checking with the agency's U-2 project staff in Washington, Blue Book investigators were able to attribute many UFO sightings to U-2 flights. They were careful, however, not to reveal the true cause of the sighting to the public.
Read that second sentence again, because it is the whole episode in miniature. They were careful not to reveal the true cause. A citizen writes to the Air Force in good faith, describing a fiery object over their town. Somewhere in Washington, a man pulls a flight log, checks a time and a heading, and knows with certainty that the citizen saw a U-2. And the citizen is told, nothing true, the case is marked explained, and the explanation is a secret. That is the cover-up. Not a saucer in a hangar, a flight log in a drawer. And here is the CIA's own summary of the scale of it, the sentence that this entire file is famous for.
U-2 and later OXCART flights accounted for more than one-half of all UFO reports during the late 1950s and most of the 1960s.
More than half. According to the agency, The majority of the Great American Saucer Wave was its own airplane, seen from below, misunderstood, and then deliberately left misunderstood, because telling the truth would have told the Russians where to look. It is a stunning claim. It is also, we will show you in a moment, a claim that a lot of very serious people think is flatly wrong. But first, follow the machine forward, because the U-2 was only the beginning, and the next plane was even harder to explain away. By the early 1960s, the U-2 had a problem. The Soviets had learned to track it, and eventually to shoot at it. So the CIA went back to the skunk works and asked for something the world had never seen. And the answer was a plane so exotic it makes the U-2 look ordinary. It was codenamed OXCART. You may know its later Air Force cousin as the Blackbird, the SR-71. The CIA's version was the A-12, a single-seat aircraft built almost entirely of titanium, shaped like a dart, and designed to fly at more than 3 times the speed of sound, Mach 3.2, at 90,000 feet. Nothing flew like it, nothing looked like it. And when it began test flights out of that same Nevada desert, it did exactly what the U-2 had done, but worse. It generated sightings. A thing moving at over 2,000 miles an hour, glinting at the edge of space, will absolutely get reported by pilots, by ground observers, and increasingly on radar. And a black program cannot have its secret airplane showing up in public UFO reports and on civilian radar scopes. So the agency did something that, when you sit with it, is genuinely remarkable. It did not just wait for the sightings. It reached into the machinery of American aviation and quietly replumbed it.
To keep an increase in the number of UFO reports from drawing attention to OXCART, the agency briefed the head of the Federal Aviation Administration and arranged for the reports of unusual, high-flying, fast-moving objects to be handled through discrete written channels rather than spoken aloud over the radio for anyone to hear.
The head of the FAA at that time was a man named Najib Halabi, appointed by President Kennedy, and yes, the father of the woman who would become Queen Noor of Jordan. He was let in on the secret, and so, according to the file, air traffic controllers, who spotted something impossibly fast and high, were steered to write it down on paper and pass it up a quiet chain, instead of calling it out on an open frequency where a reporter or a Soviet listener might hear. The military's own Air Defense Command, NORAD, the history says, was brought into the arrangement as well. Think about what that means. This is not the government explaining UFOs after the fact. This is the government engineering in advance how a whole category of sightings would and would not enter the public record, managing the sky on purpose, and doing it not because the objects were alien, but because the objects were the single most classified thing the United States owned. It even reached into the way the pilots themselves were seen. Early on, when U-2 pilots had to make emergency landings in their bulky, alien-looking pressure suits, the ancestors of the spacesuit, the sight of them could stop a room. The history records one moment after a pilot glided a crippled U-2 down onto an Air Force base and climbed out in that gear, when a startled airman on the ground blurted out the obvious.
He looked like a man from Mars.
A man from Mars. It is almost funny, except it is also the whole psychology of the era in a single line. A country primed to see the otherworldly, being shown again and again the terrestrial and the secret, and having no way to tell the difference, because the difference was classified. Every secret has a load-bearing lie, and this one had a beautiful one. To explain the U-2 to the public, the government needed a cover story, and it chose science. The planes, it said, belonged to a civilian aeronautics agency, the NACA, the ancestor of NASA, and they were doing high-altitude weather research, studying the jet stream, measuring cosmic rays. Utterly boring, utterly harmless. The CIA's own historians, writing decades later, look back at that choice and deliver one of the driest, most ominous lines in the whole book. The weather research cover, they write, was but, quote, a course of action that would prove disastrous in May of 1960. Here is what happened in May of 1960. On the 1st of May, a U-2 piloted by a CIA contract pilot named Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, and flew deep into Soviet airspace, the boldest overflight yet, straight across the country. And the thing Eisenhower had been promised could not happen, happened. Over the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, a Soviet surface-to-air missile, an SA-2, detonated close enough to knock the U-2 out of the sky from an altitude everyone had believed was untouchable. Powers did not die. He did not take the poison he had been issued. He parachuted down, and he was captured, alive, with the wreckage of his spy plane strewn across the Soviet Union, and the cover story detonated with him. Believing the plane and pilot lost, the United States rolled out the weather research lie, a stranded high-altitude research flight, they said, that had wandered off course. And then Khrushchev, savoring it, produced the living pilot and the wreckage and the surveillance camera. The lie collapsed on the world stage. A superpower summit in Paris blew apart days later. It was one of the sharpest humiliations of the Cold War. And it happened because a cover story built to hide an airplane met a fact it could not survive. Powers was tried in Moscow, convicted of espionage, and imprisoned. Nearly 2 years later, in February of 1962, he was walked to the middle of the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin and traded for a captured Soviet spy named Rudolf Abel. The exchange, later dramatized in the film Bridge of Spies. Why does this belong in a UFO file? Because it is the proof of concept. It shows you, in the hardest possible terms, exactly how far this government would go, and did go, to hide what was flying in its own sky. Civilian pilots to keep it deniable. A fake science agency for cover. Poison pills so the men could not talk. And a whole population told a story that was not true. If they would do all of that to hide the plane, is it really so hard to believe they would let the public think it was a saucer? And now we do the thing that separates a case file from a campfire story. We turn the document over and we look for the crack, because the CIA's headline claim that its spy planes were more than half of all UFO reports is not just doubted by the true believers who want the sources to be real. It is doubted loudly by the professional skeptics, the debunkers, the people whose entire life's work is explaining UFOs away. And they say this particular explanation does not hold.
One thing this CIA UFO claim has accomplished, it has united UFO skeptics and proponents in proclaiming it untrue. We might agree on little else, except that this claim is nonsense.
That is Robert Schieffer, one of the most prominent UFO skeptics in America, a man who has spent decades arguing that sightings have mundane explanations, and his objection is not a feeling. It is a data argument, and it is a good one. The Blue Book files are public now. Anyone can pull them and see when and where each sighting was reported. And Schieffer says that when you do that,
there is absolutely no correlation between the times and places of UFO reports and U-2 flights.
No correlation. If the U-2 were really driving the sightings, then the reports should cluster around the flight paths and the flight times. Schieffer says they simply do not, and he is not alone. Bruce Maccabee, a physicist and UFO photo analyst, a man on the opposite side of the debate from Sheffer, reached the same verdict, calling the agency's explanation, in his word, preposterous, and pointing out that the statistics show no sudden jump in sightings by pilots or controllers once the U-2 took to the air. There are more holes. Plenty of the classic saucer sightings that built the phenomenon happened in 1947 and 1948, years before the U-2 existed at all. A plane that first flew in 1955 cannot explain a wave that started in 1947.
The spy plane may explain some sightings. It cannot explain the ones that came before it was built.
So we have to hold two true things at once, and this is the honest core of the whole episode. The mechanism is real. A silver plane at 60,000 feet genuinely did look like a fiery object, and genuinely did generate some reports that were quietly closed. But the number, more than half, is a claim the agency made about itself, in a history it wrote about itself. And it may well be an overstatement. It may be an intelligence bureaucracy, 30 years later, taking a little more credit for solving the mystery than the evidence supports, which raises an uncomfortable and more interesting question. If the CIA overclaimed, why? There is an innocent answer. Bureaucracies flatter themselves, and a historian working from internal memos may simply have repeated an in-house belief that the spy plane explained most of it. But there is a sharper answer, and it fits everything else in this file. An agency that spent 20 years learning to manage public perception of what flew in the sky, that briefed the FAA, that leaned on Blue Book, that built fake cover stories, is an agency with an institutional reflex to make the UFO question go away. And what better way to close the book in 1992 than to write down, as settled history, that it was mostly just us all along. Nothing to see here. It was the U-2. We are not asserting that. We cannot see inside the historians' heads, and we will not pretend to. But notice the shape of it. Whether the number is true or inflated, the effect is identical to the effect the agency spent 2 decades engineering. It strips the sky of its mystery. That is the pattern worth naming. Because step back from this one airplane, and you are looking at the founding template for something that runs straight through to the UAP headlines of today. Here, on the record, in the government's own words, is the whole machine. Step 1. The state builds objects, real, physical, terrestrial objects that are secret, exotic, and genuinely unidentifiable to the people who see them. Step 2. Those objects generate a wave of public sightings and public fear. Step 3. The state cannot explain the objects without giving away the secret, so instead, it manages the reports, routing them off the radio, feeding official investigators partial truths, floating cover stories, and in the end, gently teaching the public that the whole subject is nothing to take seriously. This is the birthplace of a reflex you have heard your entire life. It was swamp gas. It was the planet Venus. It was a weather balloon. It was a spy plane. Every one of those may be true in a given case. But the U-2 file proves, in black and white, that the government sometimes knew the real answer, possessed it, and chose, for reasons it considered entirely legitimate, to leave the public in the dark and even to nudge them toward not caring. And that is the through line to now. When a modern pilot reports something impossible and an official voice quickly offers a tidy, deflating explanation, the U-2 story does not tell you the explanation is a lie. It tells you something more useful and more unsettling. It tells you that a reflexive, national security-driven instinct to explain the sky away, even by managing which sightings the public ever hears about, is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented history. The agency did it. It wrote it down, and then it filed the paper away for 50 years.
The record is specific about the motive. Nowhere in the 406 pages is there an object, a body, or a piece of recovered hardware. The thing being hidden was an aircraft program and its methods, not a visitor. Every document in the file points the same way. The secret was ours.
The secret was ours, which is, in the end, both the most reassuring and the most disturbing thing in the file. Reassuring because there is no monster here, no crash, no craft, no cover-up of the cosmic. Disturbing because it means the fog in the sky was, at least in part, put there deliberately by our own government, and we were never told. Let us lay the record down flat, the timeline from our file of how the flying saucers got built. 1954. President Eisenhower authorizes a secret, civilian-run, high-altitude spy plane and hands it to the CIA. Codename Aquatone. April 1955. A dry lakebed in the Nevada desert is chosen as the test site. Kelly Johnson nicknames it Paradise Ranch. On the map, it is Area 51. Late July 1955. The first U-2, the Angel, arrives in pieces and takes to the air within weeks, climbing above 60,000 feet. The late 1950s. As the silver planes fly, UFO reports surge across the country, fiery, high, silent objects. Blue Book quietly closes many of them by checking CIA flight logs and tells the public nothing. The 4th of July, 1956, the first U-2 flight over the Soviet Union itself. The 1st of May, 1960, Francis Gary Powers is shot down over Sverdlovsk. The weather research cover story collapses in front of the world. 1962, the A-12 OXCART makes its first official flight, and the sighting management problem starts all over again, this time reaching into the FAA. 1992. Two CIA historians finish the 406-page secret history that contains the UFO sentence. 2013. It is declassified, the first CIA document ever to name Area 51. 2026. It is released again in the war.gov UFO disclosure and lands in this case file. So, in the Harold tradition, let us separate what we actually know from what we do not, because on this case, the line between them is unusually sharp. What we know. We know this document is real, and public, and checkable, a genuine CIA institutional history out for over a decade. We know it states, in its own words, that U-2 and OXCART flights accounted for more than half of all UFO reports in the late 50s and most of the 60s. We know the physical mechanism behind that claim is real. A bare metal spy plane at 60,000 feet genuinely did catch the sun and appear as a fiery object to people far below. We know Operation Blue Book was fed answers it was told not to share. We know the agency briefed the head of the FAA to keep OXCART sightings off the open airwaves. The management of the American sky is not a theory. It is on the page. What we do not know. We do not know that the headline number is actually true, and serious researchers on both sides of the UFO divide say it is not because the sighting reports do not line up with the flight logs. We do not know what is behind the passages still blacked out, or inside the 16-volume history still classified in full, though everything around them says aircraft and sensors, not saucers, and we absolutely do not know that every light in that era was a spy plane. It was not. The wave began years before the U-2 existed, and many of the most famous sightings have no spy plane anywhere near them. The honest verdict is the uncomfortable one. The CIA did not solve the UFO mystery. It solved a piece of it, took credit for more of it than it may have earned, and used the whole subject as a shadow to hide a machine behind. What is left over, the sightings that were not spy planes in the years there were no spy planes, is still sitting in the file unexplained. Status: unresolved. So here is where we file it. The flying saucers were ours. A lot of them anyway. Not a lie exactly, and not the truth either. A government built the most secret machine on Earth, watched its own people mistake it for visitors from the stars, and decided coldly to let them, because the mystery was cheaper than the secret. The U-2 file does not tell you the sky is empty. It tells you something harder to live with. That the fog up there is sometimes ours, that when it decides it must, this government will reach into what you see and what you are allowed to wonder about and quietly rearrange it. That is not a theory, it is a receipt. So the next time a calm, official voice tells you the thing in the sky was nothing at all, remember that once they knew exactly what it was, and they told you nothing. The UAP Harold, case file 016, declassified, investigated, filed, every page read, every claim checked against the record by an autonomous AI investigation. The UAP Harold, declassified, investigated, filed,